John Brown was a radical abolitionist and a fierce warrior against slavery who became one of the most controversial figures in American history. John Brown, the militant opponent of slavery, was born in Torrington, Connecticut on May 9, 1800. He came from a deeply religious family. He had an intense, penetrating gaze that seemed to look into men's souls. Brown's business ventures were numerous but largely unsuccessful. He was raised in a strict Calvinist household where his father taught him that slavery was a sin against God. When he was 12 years old, young John witnessed the brutal beating of a slave boy, an experience that would haunt him for the rest of his life and cement his hatred of the peculiar institution. Then in the 1830s and 1840s, Brown moved his growing family from place to place, attempting various business enterprises including tanning, land speculation, and sheep farming. John Brown was a father of 20 children by 2 wives, though many died in childhood. In 1837, when the abolitionist newspaper editor Elijah Lovejoy was murdered by a pro-slavery mob, Brown publicly declared his dedication to destroying slavery. Brown was not a gradualist who believed slavery would fade away through moral persuasion. He was a man of action who believed that slavery was so evil, so corrupting, so against God's law that it must be destroyed by any means necessary, including violence. In 1847, Brown met Frederick Douglass, the famous escaped slave and abolitionist speaker. Douglass was impressed by Brown's commitment but troubled by his willingness to use violence. Brown told Douglass that slavery was a state of war and that enslaved people had the right to fight for their freedom with weapons. Brown was not wealthy. He struggled throughout his life with poverty and debt. His business failures mounted. But he was a man possessed by a single vision, the destruction of slavery in America. In 1855, Brown followed 5 of his sons to the Kansas Territory. Kansas was bleeding. The territory had become a battleground between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces, each side determined to control whether Kansas would enter the Union as a slave state or a free state. Brown arrived in Kansas and immediately joined the Free State forces. He was 55 years old, but he had the energy and determination of a much younger man. The violence in Kansas escalated. Pro-slavery forces sacked the Free State town of Lawrence, burning buildings and destroying printing presses. Brown was enraged. He believed that God was calling him to take revenge, to strike terror into the hearts of slavery's defenders. On the night of May 24, 1856, John Brown led a small group including 4 of his sons to Pottawatomie Creek. They dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers from their homes and hacked them to death with broadswords. Brown claimed he was carrying out God's judgment against those who supported slavery. The Pottawatomie massacre shocked the nation. Brown had crossed a line. He had committed murder in the name of abolition. Brown became a wanted man in Kansas, but he also became a symbol of militant resistance to slavery. Some abolitionists were horrified by his violence. Others saw him as a righteous warrior doing what was necessary to combat an evil system. Brown himself never expressed remorse for the killings at Pottawatomie. He believed he was an instrument of divine justice. After the massacre, Brown continued to fight in Kansas, engaging in guerrilla warfare against pro-slavery forces. He participated in several battles and skirmishes. His reputation grew. He was called a terrorist by his enemies and a freedom fighter by his supporters. In 1857, Brown left Kansas and began traveling through the North, meeting with prominent abolitionists and seeking financial support for a bold new plan. Brown had conceived an audacious scheme. He would attack slavery in the South itself. He would raid a federal arsenal, seize weapons, and arm enslaved people who would then rise up in rebellion. It was an incredibly ambitious and dangerous plan. Many of the abolitionists who met with Brown thought he was mad, but some were intrigued. A group of wealthy abolitionists, later known as the Secret Six, agreed to provide Brown with financial backing. They gave him money to purchase weapons and supplies. Brown spent months preparing for his raid. He rented a farm in Maryland, just across the Potomac River from Virginia. He recruited followers, young men who believed in his cause and were willing to risk their lives. Brown gathered a small army of 21 men, including 5 African Americans and 3 of his own sons. He drilled them and prepared them for the attack. Brown's target was Harper's Ferry, Virginia, a small town at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers. Harper's Ferry was home to a federal armory and arsenal containing thousands of weapons. On the night of October 16, 1859, John Brown and his men moved into action. They cut telegraph wires and crossed the bridge into Harper's Ferry. They quickly seized the armory and the arsenal. They took hostages, including Colonel Lewis Washington, a great-grandnephew of George Washington. Brown's plan was to hold the armory, distribute weapons to enslaved people who would flock to his banner, and then move south through the mountains, liberating slaves and building an army as he went. But the plan immediately began to unravel. No enslaved people came to join Brown's rebellion. The local militia surrounded the armory. Brown and his men were trapped. Throughout the day on October 17, sporadic fighting erupted between Brown's men and the militia. Several of Brown's followers were killed, including 2 of his sons. Brown refused to surrender. He believed that his cause was righteous and that God would deliver him. But God did not intervene. That evening, a company of United States Marines arrived, commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee, who would later become the most famous general of the Confederacy. Lee's second-in-command was Lieutenant J.B. Stuart, another future Confederate hero. On the morning of October 18, Lee sent Stuart under a flag of truce to demand Brown surrender. Brown refused. Lee ordered the Marines to storm the armory. The assault lasted only a few minutes. The Marines battered down the door and rushed inside. Brown fought back, but he was quickly overpowered and wounded by a Marine officer's sword. 10 of Brown's men were killed in the raid, including 2 of his sons. 7 were captured, including Brown himself. 5 escaped. Brown had failed completely. His raid had lasted less than 36 hours. Not a single enslaved person had been freed. But the impact of his raid would reverberate through the nation and help push America toward civil war. Brown was taken into custody and charged with treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, murder, and conspiring with slaves to rebel. He was still recovering from his wounds when he was put on trial just 1 week after the raid. The trial was held in Charlestown, Virginia. Brown lay on a cot in the courtroom, too injured to sit. The trial lasted only 4 days. Brown's lawyers tried to argue that he was insane, but Brown rejected that defense. He was not insane, he insisted. He knew exactly what he had done and why he had done it. He was proud of his actions. The evidence against Brown was overwhelming. He was found guilty on all counts. On November 2, 1859, Brown was sentenced to death by hanging. Between his sentencing and his execution, Brown became a powerful symbol. He wrote letters from his jail cell that were published in northern newspapers. He spoke eloquently about the evil of slavery and the righteousness of his cause. He compared himself to Christ, willing to die for the sins of others. Brown's words moved many Northerners who had previously been ambivalent about slavery. He was transforming himself from a failed terrorist into a martyr. On December 2, 1859, John Brown was led to the gallows in Charlestown. 1,500 troops surrounded the execution site, including a contingent commanded by a young Virginia Military Institute professor named Thomas Jackson, who would later be known as Stonewall Jackson. Among the soldiers was a Richmond militia member named John Wilkes Booth, who would later assassinate Abraham Lincoln. Brown walked calmly to the scaffold. He handed one of his guards a note that read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think vainly, flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." At 11:15 in the morning, the trap door opened and John Brown dropped to his death. He was 59 years old. Church bells tolled across the north. Memorial services were held in many northern cities. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that Brown would make the gallows as glorious as the cross. Henry David Thoreau compared Brown to Christ. But in the South, Brown was reviled as a murderer and a terrorist who had tried to incite a slave rebellion that would have led to the massacre of white Southerners. The South saw Brown's raid and the Northern sympathy for him as proof that the North wanted to destroy the Southern way of life. Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry did not free a single slave, but it terrified the South and polarized the nation. Southerners began to believe that they could not remain in a union where many Northerners celebrated a man who had tried to start a slave insurrection. The raid accelerated the South's movement toward secession. Within 16 months of Brown's execution, the Civil War would begin. During the war, Union soldiers marched into battle singing John Brown's Body, a song that celebrated the old abolitionist. The song's melody would later be used for the battle hymn of the Republic. John Brown remains one of the most controversial figures in American history. Was he a terrorist or a freedom fighter? Was he insane or prophetic? Was he a murderer or a martyr? These questions have been debated for more than a century and a half. Brown himself would probably not have been troubled by the controversy. He believed absolutely in the righteousness of his cause. He believed that slavery was such a monstrous evil that violence against it was justified. He believed that God had chosen him to strike a blow against slavery, and he was willing to die for that belief. Brown was a man of contradictions. He was deeply religious, yet he committed murder. He spoke of love and justice, yet he showed no mercy to his victims at Pottawatomie Creek. He wanted to free enslaved people, yet his actions at Harper's Ferry put them in danger. He was a failure as a businessman, a failure as a military leader, and a failure in his raid on Harper's Ferry. But he succeeded in becoming a symbol of uncompromising opposition to slavery and a symbol of the violence that slavery would ultimately require to destroy it. Frederick Douglass, who had refused to join Brown at Harper's Ferry because he thought the plan was suicidal, later said of Brown that he had begun the war that ended American slavery. Douglass recognized that Brown's raid, though it failed militarily, succeeded in pushing the nation toward the confrontation that would finally end slavery. Brown had been willing to die for his beliefs, and his death had meaning. It inspired others. It forced Americans to confront the reality that slavery would not end peacefully, that it would require bloodshed and sacrifice. Brown's legacy is complicated. He used violence against innocent people. He was willing to sacrifice his own sons for his cause. He showed no remorse for the men he killed. Yet he also saw clearly what many of his contemporaries could not see, that slavery was an absolute evil that corrupted everything it touched, that compromise with slavery was itself a moral failure, and that slavery would only end through violent conflict. Brown was right about that. The Civil War would prove him right. More than 600,000 Americans would die in that war, a war that finally ended slavery in America. John Brown did not live to see the Civil War or the end of slavery. He died on the gallows in Charlestown, Virginia, convinced that he had done God's work. He died believing that his death would not be in vain, that it would inspire others to continue the fight against slavery. And he was right about that too. His execution made him a martyr for the abolitionist cause. His willingness to die for his beliefs inspired thousands of Northerners to support the war against the South when it came. Brown's story raises profound questions about the use of violence for moral causes. Can terrorism ever be justified? Can murder be righteous? Brown would have answered yes, that when confronting absolute evil, all means are justified. Most Americans today would reject that argument. We believe in the rule of law, in democratic processes, in non-violent resistance. But Brown lived in a time when the law protected slavery, when democratic processes had failed to end it, and when non-violent resistance seemed futile. In that context, Brown's violence, while still troubling, becomes more understandable if not more acceptable. The debate over John Brown reflects larger debates about American history. How do we remember and honor those who fought against injustice but used unjust means? How do we balance our admiration for their goals with our revulsion at their methods? These are not easy questions, and there are no simple answers. John Brown forces us to confront these questions. He cannot be easily categorized as hero or villain. He was both and neither. He was a deeply flawed man who dedicated his life to a righteous cause. He was a murderer who died fighting slavery. He was a terrorist who became a martyr. In the end, John Brown's greatest legacy may be that he forced America to confront the reality of slavery and the price that would have to be paid to end it. He showed that slavery would not fade away gradually, that it would not be ended by compromise or negotiation. It would only be ended by blood, by sacrifice, by war. Brown was willing to shed that blood, to make that sacrifice. He paid with his life and with the lives of his sons. And within 2 years of his death, the entire nation would pay that price in the Civil War. John Brown was buried in North Elba, New York, on his farm in the Adirondack Mountains. His grave became a pilgrimage site for abolitionists and later for civil rights activists. His body lies moldering in the grave, as the song says, but his soul goes marching on. That soul, that uncompromising spirit of resistance to injustice, continues to inspire and trouble Americans. We remember John Brown not because he was successful but because he was willing to sacrifice everything for what he believed was right. We remember him because he saw the truth about slavery when many others did not. And we remember him because his story, with all its complexity and contradiction, is part of the American story, a story of struggle between justice and injustice, between freedom and oppression, between the ideals we profess and the reality we create.